Detective Mark Reynolds had spent decades chasing killers through the streets of San Diego, but nothing prepared him for the silence that followed. Julia Martinez, a fearless crime writer, was determined to uncover the truth behind the city's sudden drop in murders, but then she vanished without a trace. What if the decline in homicides wasn't a sign of safety, but the beginning of something far more sinister? San Diego was a place people dreamed of calling home. Warm breezes swept in from the Pacific, palm trees lined the streets, and the ocean glistened under an endless sky. Tourists filled the beaches, surfers carved through the waves, and the smell of salt water mixed with fresh fish tacos from roadside stands. To outsiders, it seemed like a city where nothing could go wrong. But behind the postcard-perfect scenes, a different reality existed. In the late 1990s, San Diego was wrestling with a darker reputation. Certain neighborhoods carried an unspoken warning, the kind you didn't need on a street sign. Residents learned to read the signs: cars slowing to a crawl, strangers lingering at corners, the distant crack of a gunshot echoing between buildings. Homicides were not rare, and the evening news often led with grim statistics. The city's beauty couldn't hide the fear that settled over families each night. People were careful about where they parked, which streets they crossed, and how late they stayed outside. Even those who never encountered violence directly felt the weight of it in the air. For years, police worked around the clock, rotating between high crime zones and emergency calls. Officers would later admit that the hardest part wasn't the violence itself, it was the feeling that nothing they did seemed to change it. Detectives chased leads that went nowhere, suspects slipped through legal loopholes, and witnesses were too afraid to speak. Community leaders tried to bring people together through neighborhood watch programs, youth activities, and local events. The efforts made small dents, but the numbers stayed high. Then, almost without warning, something began to shift. The early 2000s brought a slow but steady decline in homicide cases. First, it was a few fewer murders per year, then dozens. By the mid-2010s, the change was impossible to ignore. San Diego's murder rate had dropped to levels most cities envied. News anchors smiled as they read the reports. City officials praised reforms in policing, investments in community services, and advancements in forensic technology. For many, it was a victory story, proof that determination could reclaim a city from the edge. But not everyone celebrated. In hushed tones, a handful of retired investigators spoke of another possibility. They didn't believe the decline told the whole story. Something about the change felt too clean, too perfect. A few even hinted at an invisible factor, something that couldn't be explained by budget increases or better patrols. Officially, there was no proof. Unofficially, there was unease, the kind that doesn't fade just because the numbers look better. And somewhere in the city, quiet rumors began to spread that the real reason for San Diego's safety was not safety at all. By 2015, San Diego was being held up as a national example of how to turn a city around. Crime graphs shown on evening news broadcasts curved sharply downward, and the homicide rate was at its lowest point in decades. The change was so dramatic that it seemed almost too good to be true. For the public, the explanation was simple: better policing, smarter technology, and stronger community bonds. But behind closed doors, not everyone accepted that story without question. Among the skeptics were a few retired detectives who had lived through the city's most violent years. They had seen how cases unfolded, how investigations hit dead ends, and how long it really took for change to take root. To them, the numbers didn't just drop, they vanished, almost abruptly. When they looked closer, they noticed something unsettling. Some deaths never made it into the homicide statistics at all. Instead, they appeared in other categories: accidents, medical emergencies, or unexplained but non-criminal causes. It was easy for the public to overlook these reclassifications. An elderly woman drowned in her own bathtub, tragic, but believable. A construction worker crushed beneath a fallen shelf, an industrial mishap, nothing more. A jogger collapsing from heat stroke on a crisp winter morning, sad, but not suspicious. Alone, each case could be explained away. But when one retired officer began keeping his own records, he found something disturbing. Over several years, these incidents clustered in certain areas, almost like invisible hotspots. The most concerning part was that the locations often repeated. The same blocks, the same alleyways, sometimes even the same buildings. It was as if a quiet pattern was playing out under the city's nose, and no one in authority wanted to acknowledge it. Officially, the cause of death in each case was accepted without dispute: Unofficially, a few officers who had responded to the scenes admitted that something about them had felt wrong, marks that didn't fit the story, witness statements that were inconsistent, or in some cases, no witnesses at all. As the years went on, the pattern grew harder to ignore. Yet those who noticed it also understood that digging too deeply could be risky. The police department had little interest in revisiting closed cases, and the public preferred the comforting narrative that their city had become safer. But beneath the clean numbers, the retired detectives began to suspect that the drop in homicides might not mean fewer deaths, only that the deaths were being hidden in plain sight. The neighborhood where these strange cases seemed to cluster was called Marlow Heights. Once a rough area, it had undergone a transformation over the past 20 years. Crumbling buildings were replaced with modern homes, new shops opened on corners that once held boarded-up storefronts, and the streets were clean and well-lit. Families moved in, and with them came hopes of safety and a fresh start. On paper, Marlow Heights was now one of the most desirable parts of San Diego to live. But those who had lived in the area during the more violent times often had a different story. Many had left quietly, moving out without fanfare or explanation. Public records showed that dozens of residents had changed addresses or disappeared from city registries altogether. Neighbors rarely saw moving trucks or heard goodbyes, just an empty house waiting for new occupants. Over time, these homes were remodeled or torn down, erasing visible traces of their previous owners. It was as if the past had been scrubbed clean. The new residents of Marlow Heights mostly believed the city's story, that the area had been saved by progress and community efforts. But a few locals whispered about a lingering unease. Some reported strange noises at night, soft footsteps, doors creaking, or muffled voices that vanished when approached. Others felt watched when walking alone, especially near the old parts of the neighborhood that remained untouched by gentrification. It wasn't fear born of crime statistics, but something more subtle, an instinctive warning that the calm was fragile. The block at the center of these rumors was home to an abandoned apartment complex that had been closed for decades. It had once been a lively place, full of families and small businesses, until a fire had ravaged the building in 1999. The cause was never fully explained, and the city left the site untouched ever since. No developer showed interest, and the building slowly fell into ruin. Its boarded-up windows and rusted gates gave the block an eerie feeling, especially after dark. Local urban explorers tried to get inside, but the building was heavily secured. Despite this, faint sounds sometimes drifted out, the scrape of furniture, a door creaking open, or whispers carried on the wind. Passers-by quickened their steps, unsure if what they heard was real or just their imagination. The mystery of the abandoned complex seemed tied to the disappearances and suspicious deaths, but no one dared to confront it directly. And Marlow Heights moved on while the past quietly lingered just beyond sight. In 2018, a freelance crime writer named Julia became interested in the unusual reports surrounding Marlow Heights. Unlike most journalists who accepted official statements, she dug deeper, gaining access to files collected by the retired detective who had first noticed the strange pattern of deaths and disappearances. Julia spent weeks poring over case files, police reports, and city records. She carefully mapped every suspicious incident, plotting locations and dates. What emerged was a chilling picture, an invisible ring of incidents all centered around the abandoned apartment complex. Each case seemed unrelated at first: an overdose, a fall, a sudden illness. But as Julia connected the dots, a disturbing pattern emerged. The timeline of these incidents stretched over nearly 2 decades, and the physical locations created a circle that no one had publicly acknowledged. She noticed how often the victims had ties to Marlow Heights, friends, family, or residents who had vanished without explanation. What made it worse was how quickly official investigations closed, often with little follow-up or transparency. Determined to uncover the truth, Julia visited Marlow Heights herself. During the day, the neighborhood seemed peaceful and welcoming. Children played in parks, neighbors chatted over fences, and cafes bustled with customers. But her attention kept returning to the block with the abandoned apartments. The building sat like a scar on the neighborhood, boarded up, fenced, and silent. Attempts to get inside were met with locked gates and no trespassing signs. One evening, as dusk fell, Julia stood near the entrance. She heard faint noises from within, soft thuds, scraping sounds, and the creak of old wood. It was as if someone was moving furniture, or someone was trapped inside trying to make their presence known. Her heartbeat quickened. She returned night after night, sometimes with a small flashlight, trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on inside. But the building remained stubbornly closed, and the sound stopped when she got too close. Julia sent emails and letters to city officials, requesting information about the abandoned complex and the unusual deaths nearby. No one responded. Weeks later, she disappeared without a trace. Her apartment was found intact, her research materials gone, and no clues left behind. The police ruled it a missing person case but never linked it to her investigation. The abandoned building stayed silent, and the mystery deepened. The one place tied to San Diego's declining homicide rate had become a haunting symbol of secrets the city was unwilling to reveal. After Julia vanished, the official story remained the same. San Diego was safer than ever, and the decline in homicides was proof of progress. The police celebrated new community programs and technological advances, praising them for the city's transformation. Residents in Marlow Heights continued to live their lives, without openly questioning the sudden disappearance of so many old neighbors or the strange noises from the abandoned building. Yet beneath this surface calm, something unsettling was quietly taking place. The city's public records showed a drop in murders, but a rise in unexplained disappearances and deaths classified under vague causes. Families reported missing loved ones, but their cases rarely made headlines. Some were quietly closed without resolution, dismissed as runaways or accidents. The abandoned apartment complex, once sealed off, was rumored to have been repurposed by unknown occupants. Lights were occasionally seen flickering inside, and faint voices were heard late at night, but no one dared investigate. Insiders whispered that the decline in homicide statistics came at a price. The lives that once appeared as violent crimes were now being erased from official records through other means: disappearances, accidents, or deaths labeled as natural causes. A few former officers who tried to speak out were silenced by threats or lost their jobs. The system had shifted from tackling violent crime openly to hiding it in shadows where it could no longer be counted. Despite the dark rumors, the city's image remained untarnished. Tourists arrived in record numbers, property developers invested millions, and new residents moved into Marlow Heights without a second thought. The abandoned apartment block was still there, a silent witness to the secrets it held. Locals learned to avoid the area after dark, their curiosity tempered by a deep, unspoken fear. Julia's disappearance became a whispered cautionary tale, proof that some truths were too dangerous to uncover. The mysterious drop in homicides wasn't a victory. It was a cover-up. Behind the numbers lay a story of vanished people, erased histories, and a community that chose silence over safety. San Diego's streets might have seemed safer, but the price was paid in shadows, and the shadows were still watching.